I'm tempted to say this morning's subject is Jesus' trial, but I don't really want to use that word because there's so much about it that's illegal. It was a battering. It was an interrogation. What purported to be a trial was illegal. So we're really going to look at Jesus' interrogation. You remember that they had celebrated the Passover. And after that Passover meal, they'd gone out into the Garden of Gethsemane. And the Lord had taken aside Peter and James and John. And there'd been that time when the Lord had been agonizing in prayer, knowing full well what lay ahead, agonizing. Was there some other way, some alternative to this route by which sinners were going to be pardoned? Their debt was going to be paid, but was there no other way that it could be done? And do you remember how he concludes? Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. He's content to go ahead. And as they go out, he's arrested. And there, late at night, perhaps 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the afflictions begin. And they begin in last week's passage. And so we'll just remind ourselves of some of the stuff, the things that we went over with David last week. If you look at verse 54 of chapter 2, then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house. They brought him to the high priest's house. Remember, this is at the dead of night. They brought him to the high priest's house. And then at verse 63, and the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. This is the temple guard. They mocked him and smote him. When they blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And many other things blasphemously spake they against him. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then said they all, Art thou then the Son of God? And he said unto them, Yea, you see that I am. And they said, What need we any further witness? For ourselves have heard of his own mouth. Then follows the verses that are allotted to us today. And there are 5 phases of interrogation that our Lord goes through before the cross and the crucifixion even begins. 5 phases, the ones we read about in the reading and the ones I've just added as the preliminaries before our passage for today. So I want to look at those 5 phases first of all, and then draw out some challenges and some applications for ourselves. So first of all, the first, illegal interrogation. If you look at verses 63 and 64 of last week's passage, the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. This is the temple guard. And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? Remember, way back in verse 54, they're in the high priest's house. They've gone there. Such as the hatred that the clerics had towards Jesus, that they at least permitted the temple guard to beat him. Maybe they took part as well, but at the very minimum, they permitted the temple guard to beat him and to mock him in this way. If you look at verse 66, as soon as it was day, All this was done in the dark of the night. They were beating him, mocking him, ill-treating him. In the hours of darkness. Remember, he's had no rest since the previous night. But then in verse 66, as soon as dawn comes, then they assemble together, the elders, the chief priests, into their council. And there's an interrogation that takes place here, which is not recorded by Luke. But I want to look at all of the Gospels to try and put together a fairly complete picture. So if you go to Matthew chapter 26, Matthew chapter 26 and verse 59. Now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. They're looking for a way to condemn him. They know what the outcome is that they want. They want death. Now they've got to find a reason. It's logic inverted. There's no justice about this. And then in verses 63 and 64 of Matthew chapter 26, 63 and 64, Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell me whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said, Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Jesus confirmed that he was the Son of God. And now the high priest believes that he has a cause that he can use to execute Christ. Verse 65. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. They've now got a charge, they believe, that they can use to justly execute him. And in Matthew 26, verses 67 and 68, then did they spit on his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? That's what lies behind that first phase that we're looking at here of his interrogation in the book of Luke. But notice then, it isn't until we get to Matthew chapter 27 and verse 1 that dawn comes, when the morning was come. And you find the same thing in Luke. At the end of this first interrogation, you find in verse 66 of chapter 22. And as soon as it was day, they now convened their council, and they were now going to have what they believed would be a legal trial. All that had happened in the hours of darkness was illegal. It was strictly illegal according to Jewish law. It should not have happened. You cannot hold a trial in the hours of darkness when a man's life is at stake. And so that's why they make a point here in verse 66 of our passage. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council. Now they're going to dot the I's and cross the T's and bring a sentence upon him in the hours of daylight that he might be executed. So we now come to the second phase of his interrogation before the council, before the Sanhedrin. They want him dead. And they believe now that they've got a charge that they can bring before him, blasphemy. But they have to get him to say it again in this formal meeting now, in the hours of daylight. And so we find them questioning, once again, verse 67, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. Art thou the Christ? They want to get him in the hours of daylight, in the formality, how they love formality and dotting the I's and crossing the T's. They want to get him to say it in the hours of daylight. Tell us. And he said unto them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And it goes on, the interrogation, the battering. And we come to verse 70. Then said they all, art thou then the Son of God? And he said unto them, ye say that I am. He's admitting. At last he admits it. Triumph. They've succeeded. They've dotted the I's. They've crossed the T's. In the hours of daylight, before the council, they've got him, they say, to admit that he's the Son of God. They can bring the charge of blasphemy, and they can therefore condemn him to death under Jewish law. But now there's another problem. They are, of course, Jews who are under occupation by the Roman forces, and they have no right to impose capital punishment. They can't execute people. And so they have to get the Romans to do it. Now, the Romans aren't going to be very impressed with some belief that they have about God and him saying he's the Son of God. That won't stir the Roman authorities. So they need another charge. So we start again. We've got to find a new charge. And they take him before Pilate. And in chapter 23 and verse 1, the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. But what are they going to charge him with? Well, if you look at verse 2, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Stop at that point. Forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. If you go back to Luke chapter 20 and verse 25, when they were talking about tribute for Caesar in verse 24, show me a penny, says Jesus, whose image and superscription hath it? And they answered and said, Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. They'd asked him about giving tribute. And he'd actually said, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Whose face is on the penny? It's Caesar's. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So this first part of the charge is an outright lie. It's the way that they're going about things. And then they go on with the charge, and they say that he's the king of the Jews. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate, verse 3, asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, thou sayest it. He admits it. And then said Pilate unto the chief priests, unto the people, I find no fault in him. Now, there's a gap between verses 3 and 4, and once again, we need to fill it in from another gospel. If you go to John chapter 18, you find that there's another piece of the argument that goes in there. Verses 36 to 38 of John chapter 18. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, but I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou then a king? And he answered, thou sayest, I am a king. So he admits being a king, but not in this world. And so you see, actually there is a logic to the way in which Pilate immediately then releases him, or tries to release him. Pilate, verse 4 of our passage, then Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in him. His kingdom's not of this world. We've discovered in the Gospel of John. Until we come to verse 5. And they were the more fierce, the crowds more fierce. He stirreth up a people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. They're adamant. They must get this man executed. Whatever the charge, they don't care. Now, at this time, it's estimated that there were about 500,000 people in Jerusalem because it was the Passover. Crowds and crowds had come. They always did. And that's why Pilate was there. And incidentally, as we'll see in a moment, Herod was there too, to make sure that everything was done decently in order. So this is getting quite serious. And Pilate sees no fault in the man. His kingdom's of another world. But there's beginnings of an uprising. They're the more fierce, crying out. They want him crucified. What's he to do? He's sure to keep the peace. And I don't know if you noticed in verse 5 when I read it, I'll read it again. They were the more fierce, saying, he stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Here's an idea, thinks Pilate. Is he from Galilee? And so Pilate checks up, is he from Galilee? Yes, he is. Now, Herod had responsibility for Galilee, so he can get rid of the problem. Send him to Herod. And so that's his solution. Send him to Herod. Get rid of the problem. And so we come to the fourth phase of his interrogation. He goes to Herod. But we need to remember that Herod had taken his brother's wife to be his wife. And John the Baptist had condemned Herod for doing that. And Herod in turn, you remember when the young girl danced, Herod had condemned John the Baptist to be executed. But then he started hearing rumors about this man who was going around preaching and doing miracles. Jesus, of course. But he thought, is that John the Baptist come back from the dead? And he was fearful of Herod. And in Luke chapter 9, verses 7 to 9, you find that he was afraid of Jesus. He was intrigued, but he wanted Jesus dead. Luke chapter 13, verse 31. But also there's the intrigue. Wouldn't it be nice to see some miracles? So this is the man that Jesus now goes before. And he interrogates Jesus, asks him questions. Verse 8, and when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And they questioned him, verse 9, many words, but he answered them nothing. Remember Isaiah 53, as a sheep before his shearers was done, so he opened not his mouth. He never tried to defend himself. He wouldn't rise to these questions. And so Pilate sent him back. And we come to the fifth phase, where Jesus is now back before Pilate. The problem has come back to Pilate. What is he to do? Verse 13. Pilate, when he had called chief priests and the scribes and the rulers together, he said, ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. But now he goes on. No, nor yet Herod, for I have sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done in him. Herod agrees with me. There is nothing wrong with this man. What's he to do? What can you do about it? This is the problem that he was trying to avoid, and it come back. Verse 16, he proposes a solution. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Why chastise him? He's not yet been found guilty of anything. We followed it detail by detail. He's never yet been found guilty of anything. But that's his proposal. A sop to the Jews. We'll give him a good beating and let him go. But the people aren't satisfied with that. What are you to do? In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 15, we read that Pilate had a habit at Passover of allowing the people to choose a criminal and let him go free. Another idea. What I'll do, I will set him free. Verse 17. Of a necessity, he must release one unto them at the feast. That's going to be the solution. We'll release him. But, verse 18, and they cried out all the once, saying, away with this man. Release him unto us. Release Barnabas unto us. And then, according to Luke, the next thing we know is that Pilate releases him. Verses 20 to 25. And Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, why? What evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were instant, with loud voices, requiring that he should be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. Why did Pilate suddenly give in? The Gospel of John gives us the reason. In John chapter 19 and verse 12, you'll see that the Jews started to say, whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Now this is getting quite dangerous for Pilate. His career is now at stake. This man says he's a king, and we're going to tell Caesar that you're no friend of his because you released Jesus, the King of the Jews. And he's a rival to Caesar. So his career is at stake. And for that reason, Pilate gives in. It happens rather suddenly in our passage, but that's the background in the Gospel of John. Verses 24 and 25 again. Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required, and he released them unto them. For sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired. But he delivered Jesus to their will. And their will, of course, was crucifixion. 5 batches of interrogation before he even gets to the cross. After a sleepless night, after agonies in the garden. This is what our Saviour went through before we ever got to the crucifixion. But I want to take you back now to Luke chapter 22 and verse 69, to a verse that I glossed over. They'd been questioning Jesus, and I'll read 68 as well. And if I also ask you, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of glory. Now this is a reference to Daniel's dream. And if you turn to Daniel chapter 7, you'll find what Jesus is referring to. Daniel chapter 7 and verses 13 and 14. I saw in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Jesus is citing that. And the interesting thing is that if you look back at Luke chapter 22 and the following verse, verse 70, you see that they actually recognized the reference. Then said they all, art thou then? Notice that little word then. They don't say, art thou the Son of God? They say, art thou then the Son of God? That word then refers us back to the reference which Jesus has made to himself as that Son of God, who one day will be sitting on the right hand of the Father, subsequently will come back and he will be the ruler over the nations. What a warning. One day, you who mock me will stand before my judgment seat. One day, these things will be reversed. Think, first of all, about the chief priests and their illegal interrogation in the chief priest's house. How the temple guard had mocked him. He was a nobody, a piece of scum. But one day, he'd sit on the judgment throne and they'd be paraded before him. The chief priests included, experts in religion. Oh, they knew what they were doing. They knew the Jewish law. All they had to do was manufacture a charge of blasphemy and they could legally kill him. But one day, they'd stand before him as he sat upon his throne of judgment. Well, think about the Sanhedrin. After day had broken, this was to be their formal legal trial when they were going to condemn him. What they didn't like about him was they got things organized. The religion and the temple was going. They were managing things okay. Why did this man have to come and intervene with his new ideas? They didn't want him. But one day their management of the temple and the worship would be over. And they'd stand before him as he sat on his throne of judgment. Or before Pilate, that first time when he was before Pilate, all Pilate wanted to do was avoid the problem of Christ. Get away from what promised to be an uprising, and he was there to keep the peace. Can't we get rid of this man somehow? And one day he would stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Or before Herod. Think about Herod. A man who one day would stand before the judgment seat of Christ with unforgiven sin. He didn't regret taking his brother's wife. There was no regret that he executed John the Baptist, quite unjustly. So a man with unforgiven sin, one day you'll stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Well, that second time, the fifth occasion, when the Lord comes before Pilate, and now his career is at stake. You can't let the king of the Jews go with it. He might challenge Caesar. You're no friend of Caesar's if you let him go. So for the sake of his career, he turns his back upon Christ. But one day his career will be over and he'll stand before the judgment seat of Christ. What will these people say on that day? But I want to take it a bit further. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Pilate, Herod, the temple guard, all of these people, they won't be alone. There'll be others who will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. You and me. What does it say? We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. that every one may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. And let me follow that up with a couple of verses in Revelation. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. It's all recorded in God's notebook. Herod's unforgiven sin. Pilate's wish to just get rid of Christ. I can't be bothered with him. All in the book. All recorded. And every one of those sins condemns. And it says that whosoever was not found written in that second book, the book of life, was cast into the lake of fire. What a solemn thing. How amazing. And it speaks to us, not just to those people that we've been talking about. But just one final thought. Barabbas was released. We're not told what Barabbas did. I wonder, newly freed, death penalty taken away, did he go to watch the crucifixion? I wonder if he stood there and looked up and saw Christ on the cross, bleeding, battered, and said to himself, I should have been there, and he should have been a free man. Like I now am. Have you ever looked at the cross in your mind's eye that way? Have you ever looked to the suffering Christ? Seen him paying the price of your sin? Whether it be because your career came first or because you couldn't be bothered to think about Christ, you didn't want the problems of Christ or all of these things, whatever it be. Have you ever, in your mind's eye, looked up to the cross and seen someone in the place that you should have been, paying the price of your sin, and asked him to be your Saviour? And if you have, great. But you can ask him again, reaffirm your interest, your joy, your satisfaction in him. But oh, if you haven't, what did it say? Whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire.